Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kay Jacobson, the History and Current Events Coordinator of the Ramsey County Libraries. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our last session of a Winter Wednesday with a Scholar program. And our speaker today is Carl Elliott from the University of Minnesota. First thing, this program today is brought to you by the Ramsey County Libraries and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota. We thank both of these organizations for making this possible so that we could share this programming with you. Okay, our speaker today, as I said, is Carl Elliott, who grew up in South Carolina, where his father was a family doctor and his mother was a librarian. He attended Davidson College, the Medical University of South Carolina, and Glasgow University in Scotland. He trained first in medicine and then in philosophy. After postdoctoral positions at the University of Chicago, the University of Otago in New Zealand, and the University of Natal Medical School in South Africa, he joined the faculty at McGill University in Montreal. Elliott moved to the University of Minnesota in 1997 to join the Center for Bioethics. He is currently at the university as a professor in the Department of Philosophy. Now, Elliott is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Award, the Carrie and Ann McGuire Chair in Ethics and American History at the Library of Congress, a resident fellowship at the Rockefeller Center in Bellagio, and a Weatherhead Fellowship at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe. His writings have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, the New York Review of Books, The New York Times, Mother Jones, and The American Scholar. He's been a visiting faculty member at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the University of Sydney, and the University of Otago, and I'm probably butchering that, but where he is an affiliate of Bioethics Center there. He currently lives in Minneapolis with his family, and the reason I have Carl speaking with us today is last year he wrote a book called, and see if you can see the screen, it's The Occasional Human Sacrifice, which is about medical experimentation and the price of saying no. So about whistleblowers and among other things. I'm really interested in this talk, and he is one of the reasons why we're on Wednesdays, along with Dave Schultz, who kicked off our series this winter, because they both could not do Tuesdays, and that's why we're on Wednesdays during the winter here. So without any further ado, I'm going to have Carl come on screen and turn things over to Carl.
Hey, thank you for that. It's good to be here. I'm just gonna share my screen with you. I've got a bunch of slides to illustrate my talk. And I hope that's working.
Looks good.
Assuming it is. All right.
It is.
Good. So, yes, I do have a new book out. It's about whistleblowers, and by whistleblowers, I mean people insiders who expose the crimes or the sins of their own group, their own organization. I think, most of us think we know how whistleblower stories go because we've read those stories in books. We've seen them in Hollywood movies. They're what Kurt Vonnegut used to call man in a hole stories. Basically, somebody gets into trouble and gets out again. Vonnegut actually used to plot this out on a graph. You can see the line goes straight, and it takes a dip, and then it returns to the baseline. People love this story. People never get tired of this story. And the reason they never get tired of it is the reassuring message. Job survives his ordeals, and God rewards him for being faithful. Dorothy defeats the wicked witch, finds her way back to Kansas. Whistleblower exposes the truth, brings down the corrupt organization. The man gets out of the hole. But there's something missing in this account. And what is missing is what it's like to be in the hole. Because when you're in the hole, you're your thoughts tend to turn inward, and the world outside the hole fades away. When you're in the hole, all you can think about is yourself and how to get out of the hole. In fact, you might not even be sure it's a hole that you're in. Could be a cave, could be a trunk of a car, could be a coffin, could be the crawl space under John Wayne Gacy's porch steps. All you know is that you're thrashing around in the dark. So, I should say that this book is framed by my own experience here at the University of Minnesota, where I spent better part of 7 years trying to get an external investigation of the suicide of a young man named Dan Markingson in a research study conducted by our Department of Psychiatry. I'll show you a picture of him and his mother, Mary Weiss. So, short version here, Dan was psychotic, delusional, under a civil commitment order in 2003 when he was recruited from a locked unit at our teaching hospital into a study of antipsychotic drugs over the objections of his mother, Mary Weiss, who was his only immediate family member. She didn't want him in the study. He was not competent to consent. He was threatening to kill people, including her. And he was under a stay of commitment order that directed him to obey the recommendations of the psychiatrist who wanted him in the study. She was told, look, he's an adult. He signed the consent form. He's in the study. So he was signed up and sent to a halfway house. Mary Weiss spent the next 4 months trying to get him out of that study. She called, she emailed, she went to the department, she wrote letters to the chair, warning again and again that he was getting worse. And in April of 2004, she left a voice message for the study coordinator saying, does he have to kill himself or somebody else before anyone does anything? 3 weeks later, Dan nearly decapitated himself with a box cutter. His body was found in the bathroom of the halfway house, along with a note that said, I went through this experience smiling. So I spent over 6 years digging into this story, which was first reported in the Pioneer Press, and trying to get it investigated. I wrote about it for Mother Jones Magazine in 2010 and spent another 5 years filing complaints to regulatory bodies, writing editorials, lobbying politicians, organizing protests, petitions, vigils, all of it with zero success. I mean, zero. This didn't make me a terribly popular figure in the medical school, as you can imagine, or in the bioethics center either, for that matter. But finally, with the help of Arnie Carlson, the former governor, we did manage to get an investigation by the Office of the Legislative Auditor, the state watchdog agency. And when that came back in March of 2015, kind of felt like a vindication. Found coercion, conflicts of interest, a lot of the things that any reasonable person should have been able to see from the start. And if this had been a movie, that's about where the credits would have started to roll. But here's the thing. Turns out that vindication isn't really the same thing as getting out of the hole. It's more like crawling out of a ditch in the middle of a desert. I would say being vindicated made my colleagues in the medical school resent me even more. And to be honest, it really didn't change anything here at the U. There was no official apology. There was no compensation for Mary Weiss. There were no sanctions for the researchers, and no real reform. So a decade later, the whole episode has been almost completely forgotten. So a number of years ago, basically as a way of trying to figure out how things might have gone better, I started teaching a class here on medical research scandals. It's a deeply demoralizing class, all scandals, only scandals, 2 a week for a whole semester. And we start with the classic abuses, like the Tuskegee syphilis study, the Willowbrook hepatitis study, and we move on to present day abuses, like the Paolo Macchiarini trachea implants in Sweden. So what I wanted to do was to put a lot of these scandals side by side so that we could compare them and see what kind of patterns emerged. In other words, I wanted to know, was my experience here at the University of Minnesota uniquely bad, or do other institutions behave the same way? What I found was that my experience here was actually pretty typical, by which I mean research institutions never do the right thing. They deny wrongdoing. They stonewall the press. They protect their own faculty. They rarely apologize and basically do whatever they can to avoid compensating the victims or their families. And the whistleblowers are ostracized, fired, sued, in at least one case reported to the police. The other thing I learned is that whistleblowers are actually pretty rare. In most cases, when there's a scandal, doctors, nurses know that patients are being harmed, they're being lied to, they're being exploited. Often they know these things for years, but they don't say anything about it. They just stay quiet. So I started to wonder about the people who did step out of line and speak out. What was different about them? How do they explain why they did what they did? And what about the people who didn't say anything at all? How do they explain it? So I'm going to start with that second question, which is bystanders to abuses. Why don't bystanders speak out and try to stop the abuses? You might think that's an easy question to answer. You just ask them. And that's what academics have done. They've gone into organizations where bad things have happened and asked people who said nothing why they kept quiet. And the bystanders generally say some combination of three things. One, I was afraid I'd be punished. Two, it would have been futile. And three, I don't rat out my own group. That's what they say. So that's what they tell themselves, presumably. But are they being honest? So I want to tell you about this empirical study, a psychology experiment about whistleblowing done in the Netherlands in 2012 and published in the journal Social Influence. It was modeled on the famous Stanley Milgram obedience studies that you may know about. These are the famous studies at Yale where 65% of subjects obeyed the orders of a man in a white coat to give what they thought could be lethal electrical shocks to another person, right? So this is a new version, a less harmful version. But in this new version, the researchers wanted to find out whether a group of university students would blow the whistle on a research study that was obviously dangerous. And so here's what they did. Got all the students together in a room. They told them that they were looking for help recruiting subjects for a study. And they arranged for them to be approached by a formally dressed scientist who was actually just an actor. I'm picturing a guy like this, man dressed in a white coat, looks like he knows what he's doing. So the fake scientist tells them about this study he's doing. He tells them, I'm working on this sensory deprivation experiment. And basically, what we do is we take our subjects, we lock them in a kind of isolation chamber where they can't see anything or hear anything, and then we keep them there and we measure their brain activity to see what happens. And the fake scientist says, we've already done this experiment before, kind of went bad. It was a pilot study. The subjects started hallucinating, couldn't think straight, kind of panicked. 2 out of the 6 tried to get out of the chamber and stop the experiment. But, that would have ruined the results. So we couldn't let that happen. So this time he says they're going to do it again. And what he wants to know of the Dutch students is, will you help me by recommending this experiment to your friends and acquaintances? All you need to do is just send them a text or an email, and we'd like you to get in touch with at least 4 people and use at least 2 of the words exciting, incredible, great, or superb, right? Now, they designed the study to make it as easy as possible for subjects to refuse and blow the whistle. So they gave them plenty of time to think about it. The fake scientists left the room so that nobody had to directly confront, an authority figure. Everybody was told that the university's research committee, the ethics committee, was still deciding whether or not they were going to approve this study, this sensory deprivation experiment. And so everybody's given a form encouraging them to register any ethical objections they might have. And they can do it completely anonymously. There'd be no way to trace their concerns back to them. Now, I'm going to tell you how many of them blew the whistle. But before I do that, let me tell you about a twist to this study, because there were actually two groups. So one group was presented with this scenario purely in theory as a kind of hypothetical, like I've presented it to you. You know, if you were asked to recruit your friends into a study like this, would you do it? And in that case, almost nobody could imagine themselves cooperating. 96% said that they would either disobey the scientist or blow the whistle or both. So that was in theory. In practice, it was different. So when the subjects were actually put in that situation, right, when they were actually getting the pitch from that fake scientist, over 3/4 of them complied. So 77% wrote those emails to their friends using words like incredible and superb. How many blew the whistle to the research committee? 9%. So less than 1 in 10. Now, remember what I said earlier about why bystanders said they wouldn't blow the whistle? One, I was afraid of retribution. Two, it wouldn't have accomplished anything. And three, I don't rat out my own group. Well, none of them applied in this case, and they still didn't blow the whistle. So clearly something else is going on, even if the bystanders don't realize it themselves. So that's the bystanders. What about the whistleblowers? Because that's what my book is actually about. Whistleblowers, not bystanders. What I wanted to do was talk to whistleblowers, try to understand why they felt compelled to do what they did, whether they were successful or not, and what happened to them. And so here are the cases that I picked. Now, I would like to be able to report back to you that these whistleblower stories had happy endings. That would not be true. They don't. It's a rare whistleblower who doesn't have a lot of at least ambivalence about their experience. And a lot of them come away deeply scarred by it. Scarred even when the whistleblowing succeeds. And those scars mark them for the rest of their lives. Even if they're not fired, even if they're not financially ruined, even if they win, because the world doesn't look the same to them anymore. So why do they do it? When I first started this book and I first started talking to whistleblowers, I thought there would be a simple way to find out why they blow the whistle, and that would be just to ask them, why did you blow the whistle? Turns out, though, when you do this, the answers that they give you are not exactly straightforward. So, in general, they don't give you a moral argument. They don't appeal to foundational principles. They don't cite legal statutes. They don't quote the Bible or the Hippocratic Oath. Instead, they say things like, well, what would I say to my children? Or how can I keep quiet and look at myself in the mirror every morning? So they answer the question with these sort of non-answers, right? Let me give you an example. I have a little bit of maybe more than a little bit of a Nixon obsession. So I tend to talk about Nixon a lot. Nixon is the sort of dark figure that haunted my childhood in the 60s and 70s. My kids have Voldemort, I have Nixon. If you remember the Senate Watergate hearings in the summer of 1973, as I do, there's one moment that's probably seared into your brain, and it's this one. It's the moment where Alexander Butterfield, a White House aide, tells the Senate Watergate Committee that Nixon had installed a secret taping system in the Oval Office. So this will turn out to be the pivotal moment in Nixon's downfall. That's the moment where he can't hide the evidence of his crimes anymore. What I want to point out, though, is not what Butterfield did, but how he explained it. Because when he was asked later why he did it, he just said, I answered truthfully because I'm a truthful person. In other words, I did it because that's the kind of person I am. Now, I'm not the first person to notice these non-explanations. So one of my favorite books on whistleblowing, highly recommended, is by a political scientist by the name of Fred Alford at the University of Maryland, who spent years interviewing whistleblowers. He admires them, but he is struck by how often whistleblowers turn a moral question about the well-being of others into a moral question about themselves. And he says, look, even if these people feel empathy for the victims of wrongdoing, even if they're acting out of principle, often that's not what they talk about. What do they talk about? They talk about themselves. They talk about facing their kids. They talk about looking in the mirror. And he calls this narcissism moralized. So he thinks whistleblowers are obsessed with their own moral purity. And so when they find themselves in organizations that are corrupt or cruel, they rebel because they want to push back against the expectation that they're like everybody else. Now, as much as I admire Alfred's book, I don't think he's quite right about this. When I talk to whistleblowers, I don't hear narcissism. What I hear is the ethic of honor and shame. Yes, it is true that whistleblowers talk about themselves. That's what honor and shame are all about. They're about maintaining your self-respect by holding yourself accountable for your moral failures, right? This is the distinguishing feature of honor. It's about your obligations to yourself. So, of course, whistleblowers talk about themselves. It's perfectly natural. The ethic of honor is fundamentally about respect and self-respect. That's what people mean when they say things like, how could I hold my head up, right? What a perfect metaphor. How can I respect myself? Because honor is not just about getting respect from others, although that is very important, is why insults require a response in the honor ethic. It's also about deserving respect. You want to be the kind of person who is worthy of the respect you get. And if you fail, you feel ashamed of yourself. That's not wounded narcissism. That's just what happens when an honorable person fails to measure up to the honor code. So, take, for example, Ron Jones. Now, Ron is one of the three doctors who exposed the so-called unfortunate experiment at National Women's Hospital in New Zealand. That's what Kiwis call it, the unfortunate experiment. So this was a study where women with a precursor of cervical cancer went untreated, sometimes for decades, with terrible results. So when I asked Ron what tipped the balance for him, his reply was, well, it's probably a reflection of the nature of the man I am. Or take Oscar Simonson. He's one of the cardiovascular surgeons who helped expose the crimes of Paolo Macchiarini. Oscar said, well, because I have to be able to hold my head up. Or John Pasando at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center in Seattle. John told me, I'd like to think I've never hurt another person in this life, at least not deliberately, and that's just who I am. To me, these people sound a lot like Alexander Butterfield. Why did I do it? I did it because I'm the kind of person who does that. That's the language of honor. Now, that said, whenever I mention the word honor, I feel like I got to step back and explain a little because it feels like a word from another era and not necessarily a good one. And when you hear it, you might be thinking honor killings. You might be thinking the military, maybe the Godfather, because there is a serious downside to the honor ethic, and that's violence. My purpose here is not to endorse the content of the honor ethic. My job, as I see it, is interpretive. Sometimes, when I talk about this, somebody will say, all this talk of honor, it makes me really uncomfortable. Couldn't you talk about professional ethics instead? Which I would gladly do if anybody that I talk to ever mentioned professional ethics to me. But they don't. What do they talk about? They talk about holding their heads up. They talk about being true to who they are. Now, if it makes you feel better, less uncomfortable, just substitute the word integrity for honor. It's very similar. The reason I use honor is because in the honor ethic, it's important not just to do the right thing, but to be seen to be doing the right thing. And this seems to be an important part of the whistleblower struggle. How do you maintain your self-respect when you've lost the respect of your community? Now, as I said earlier, one of the troubling things I found is that whistleblowers are often haunted by their experience, even if it looks from the outside as if they were successful. And it's not just because they were threatened or fired or formally punished, although a lot of them were. There seems to be something deeper going on. Sometimes it feels as if their lives were divided into two parts. There was before they blew the whistle, and there was after. There's this sort of profound existential break. Now, part of that, I think, has to do with what whistleblowers tend to be like. Blowing the whistle takes a certain amount of idealism. There's a reason cynics don't blow the whistle. They're convinced that the system is rigged. To blow the whistle, you need to have some expectation that if you speak out about something, something that's obviously cruel or corrupt or dishonest or unfair or exploitative, then other people are going to be as outraged as you are, right? But that almost never happens. You think the authorities are going to leap into action, and they don't. You think your friends and colleagues are going to stand by you, and they don't. You think you're doing the right thing, but then you're treated like Judas Iscariot. And so you come away really kind of shaken and disoriented because your whole view of the way the world works is upended. And that can drive a lot of people to a really dark place. So there was one conversation I had about this that really sticks with me. It was with Matthias Corbaccio, also a cardiovascular surgeon, one of the surgeons in Sweden who helped expose the crimes of Paolo Macchiarini at the Karolinska Institute. And Matthias told me a story. He actually grew up in California from his time in high school when police found cocaine in the car of a friend of his. And the friend told his parents that the cocaine belonged to Matthias. Matthias said, "Look, I was 17 years old. I'd never done cocaine in my life. But, you know, that feeling of being wrongly accused, that's stuck with him ever since." He said, blowing the whistle on Macchiarini felt like that. It's not just that the real offenders get off, it's that you're seen with such contempt. All your illusions that there's some kind of justice in the world get shattered. So I think that's part of what's going on here, this kind of existential disillusionment. Another part has to do with identity. Because if you're a doctor in an academic medical center, when you blow the whistle, you become radioactive. Nobody wants to be around you. Even people who might be secretly sympathetic, they're afraid to say so because they're worried that they're going to become radioactive too. And so whistleblowers are kind of sent into exile. They're cast out. They're cut off with the community, and very often it's the community has given them their sense of who they are. And they're cut off precisely because they've done what they believe honor requires them to do. And this turns out to be especially important in medical research because the oversight of medical research is literally an honor system. It was set up that way intentionally. This is the other reason I like to talk about honor. A lot of people don't know. Research is not formally regulated like a business is, right? There is nobody standing over the investigator's shoulder watching what they do. No health and safety inspectors like you'd have for a restaurant or a factory. Basically, we just trust medical researchers to be honest. We trust them to play by the rules. We trust them to actually do what they say they're doing. So it's like a college honor code in theory. But like any honor code, it depends on bystanders to speak out when they see abuses. And it turns out that rarely happens. So I think that's an important piece of this puzzle, the sense of honor, personal integrity that a lot of whistleblowers seem to feel. But there's also something else important going on here. Now, if you remember Ibsen's play, Enemy of the People, it was actually at the Guthrie, I'm thinking maybe 10 years ago or so. So this is sort of the classic whistleblower play. And it's about a whistleblower doctor named Thomas Stockman who's trying to warn the town that the water in the town is contaminated. And nobody believes him. They all turn on him. Even some of his own family turn on him. And the play ends with Stockman standing with his fist in the air saying, "The strongest man in the world is he who stands most alone." Well, that's unfortunate because the truth is pretty much exactly the opposite. Standing alone, that is a recipe for self-immolation. Because when you look at medical whistleblowers who have had at least some measure of success and survived psychologically to tell the story, what you'll often find is that there wasn't a single whistleblower standing alone. There was a group working together. So in Auckland, New Zealand, there were three: Bill McIndoe, Jock McLean, and Ron Jones. With the Macchiarini scandal in Sweden, there were four: three surgeons and a critical care doctor. With the Cincinnati radiation scandal, the whistleblower there, Martha Stevens, was working with the Junior Faculty Association. And at Willowbrook, the whistleblower, Mike Wilkins, was working with a collective of activist doctors who were all living together under one roof. So solidarity, it turns out, is crucial for psychological survival. But that's not the only way it's important. So let's go back to that original Stanley Milgram study, the one that inspired the one that I told you about. Yes, it is a very bleak study, a very bleak view of what human beings are like. But if you look carefully at Milgram's follow-up studies, which tend to be forgotten, you'll see that they pointed toward a solution to the problem. Because what Milgram found is that he could tip the scales away from obedience to authority and towards the demands of conscience if he manipulated the conditions of the study. And the biggest change was if he put dissenting Confederates in the room. So if the fake scientist is accompanied by another fake scientist who says, "You know, Jim, I don't know, this is looking bad," and expresses some kind of objection to the shocks, then not a single subject was willing to keep on shocking the victim. And if a subject was placed at a table with two other fake subjects who said, "No way, I'm not doing this," then they resisted too. So in other words, the people in the study were way more likely to follow what their conscience was telling them if they didn't feel so isolated and so alone in their dissent. So the key to dissent is solidarity. Now, I'm going to finish up with yet another demoralizing thing that I learned from teaching that course on research scandals. So I've talked about bystanders, I've talked about whistleblowers, but what about the researchers in charge of the abusive studies? What happens to them? So, got another story to tell you here. So this one takes place in June of 2017 in Cincinnati. So I'd gone to Cincinnati to meet this woman, the whistleblower. Her name was Martha Stevens. She was the whistleblowing English professor who exposed the Cincinnati radiation studies way back in 1972. So these were Pentagon-funded studies during the Vietnam War designed to figure out how radiation would affect American soldiers in case of a nuclear attack, right? How long could a pilot, pilot a plane before he passed out? That kind of thing. How long before they started to vomit? So to figure this out, there's a radiologist there called Eugene Sanger, and he was subjecting poor cancer patients, about 60% of them were Black, to total body irradiation. So without telling them why, without telling them it was for the military, and without telling them it might kill them. So I knew about this study. Martha had written a book about it called The Treatment. And I'd read there that the hospital at the University of Cincinnati had been forced to put up a memorial to the victims of that study. I'd never heard of a hospital doing such a thing. So I decided I needed to see it. But I turn up at the hospital and I can't find it. And I start asking around, and nobody there seemed to know anything about it. Never heard of the memorial, never heard of the radiation studies. Kept trying to send me to the radiology department. Have you got a radiology appointment? No, it's not about me. I'm looking for this memorial about the Cincinnati radiation studies. No idea what I was talking about. But they were very helpful. And they started calling around all over the hospital. And they eventually located a young woman from the radioisotope lab who knew what I was talking about. And so this woman came and met me. She led me through this long series of underground tunnels in the sub-basement until we finally got to a stairwell and walked up and emerged into the sunlight. And we're standing there in a kind of empty courtyard next to the parking ramp. It sort of looks like a kind of place where employees might, sneak out for a cigarette, but no memorial. And I say, um, thanks, but where's the memorial? And she points and she says, over there. And this is what she's pointing at. So I'm like, that looks like shrubbery to me. And she goes, oh, no, no. Yeah, the memorial's behind the shrubbery. And what you got to do is slide in there between the bush and the wall, and then you can see it. And so I did, and put my back to the wall and looked out, and there it was, kind of small, about 2 feet by 2 feet, and a list of names with the header that says "In Memoriam Radiation Effects Study 1960 to 72." Weird thing was it faced the wall of the hospital, right? So I took a picture or two to show Martha Stevens, wondering if she knows about this. And then the woman with me says, would you like to see the Sanger lab? And I thought to myself, wait, there's a Sanger lab, as in Eugene Sanger, as in the man behind the atrocities? And I say, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to see the Sanger lab. And so she took me up to see that. And there in the waiting room is this sort of shrine to Eugene Sanger, the architect of the radiation studies. It's got photos, it's got old medical instruments, all his honors, his awards, his gold medals, and so on. And I thought to myself, yep, that's the way these things work. To the doctor behind the atrocities, a shrine. To the victims, a plaque hidden in the shrubbery. It also turns out that if you look at other studies, you'll see something very similar. So take, for example, John Cutler, who was implicated in both the Tuskegee syphilis studies and the Guatemala syphilis studies. This is the man who, if you ever read the President's Commission report on this, on the Guatemala syphilis studies, this is a man who dripped gonorrheal pus into the eyes of a dying woman in Guatemala to see if they would become infected. So what happened to him? Well, of course, he became a dean and had a lectureship named after him at the University of Pittsburgh. This is Saul Krugman. He's the pediatrician at New York University who gave hepatitis A and hepatitis B to institutionalized mentally disabled children at the Willowbrook School. What happened to him after that was exposed? His colleagues elected him president of the American Academy of Pediatrics. This is Dr. Albert Kligman, the University of Pennsylvania dermatologist, who famously said that when he first looked at the prisoners at Holmesburg Prison in Pennsylvania, he saw, quote, acres of skin, like a farmer gazing on a fertile field. In one case, he took about $10,000 from Dow Chemicals to expose those prisoners to the active ingredient in Agent Orange. What happened to him? accolades, awards, honorary degrees, the presidency of his specialty organization. Chester Southam, who injected live cancer cells into elderly patients at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital. What happened to him? His colleagues elected him president of the American Association for Cancer Research. This is Sanger, the man I just talked about, the architect of the Cincinnati radiation studies. After he was exposed, his radiology colleagues gave him their society's highest honor. Robert Heath, he's the psychiatrist at Tulane who worked with the CIA, who accidentally killed two of his mentally ill subjects by giving them brain abscesses, and then famously tried to use deep brain stimulation to turn a gay person straight. What was his punishment? I think you're starting to see a pattern here. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's all in the distant past. Some of those honors are being reconsidered now, which is true, at least in the case of Cutler and Kligman. But you'd be wrong to think that this doesn't happen anymore. So during the 8 long years that the Markington scandal was in the public eye here in Minnesota, our chair of psychiatry just kept collecting honors and awards. And finally, if you're still hanging on to the hope that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, have a look at the bone marrow transplant scandal at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center in Seattle, where at least 21 people died. The whistleblower in that case, John Pasando, lost his job, never worked in cancer research again. He spent the rest of his life reviewing disability claims for the government. And what about the co-investigator on that study, Donald Thomas? In 1990, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine. So let me just finish by turning back to the question I started with. What does this mean for whistleblowers? So, every person in this situation, every whistleblower needs some way of making sense of what's happened to them, right? Everybody needs to tell themselves a story. And when it ends like this, with no justice at all, it's just very hard to come up with a whistleblower story that's not terribly sad and demoralizing. It's a man in the hole story where the man never gets out of the hole. Because if you measure the value of your actions by what they achieved, the story you're going to tell yourself is that you were a chump, right? You were the dumb money at the table. Everybody else knew that the system was rigged, that speaking out would do nothing, so they kept quiet. Only you were naive enough to throw away your career for nothing. And that's a very hard story to live with. Now, I do think there are alternative stories to tell. I think it helps some people to tell themselves a story of honor, for example, because what honor requires is not that you succeed, but that you're able to respect yourself when it's all over. I think for other, it helps if they can think of their story as part of a longer struggle. So for civil rights, for example, these are struggles in which a verdict is going to be rendered by history, not by your immediate success. And maybe there are other stories to tell. I don't know. Every person's different. Every situation is different. But I think the existential challenge that most whistleblowers share is the same, which is trying to come up with a story that they can live with. All right. I will stop this demoralizing talk there and stop sharing my screen. And I'm happy to talk more about it.
Okay. First question we have, you were a whistleblower. What motivated you?
First, I would say, I think I was maybe whistleblower adjacent, not really a whistleblower.
Okay.
Because I was not an insider in the proper sense. I mean, so a pure whistleblower, I think, would be somebody like John Pasando or Ron Jones, who were actually there on the wards, seeing the patients and aware of the study and with insider knowledge about what's going on. I wasn't like that. I worked in the medical school but I wasn't in the Department of Psychiatry. And I learned about this by reading about it in the St. Paul Pioneer Press. I didn't think of myself as a whistleblower. I thought of myself as, somewhere between an ethics professor and a journalist. And I wrote about it, for Mother Jones magazine.
Mhm.
Um, I think I was seen as a whistleblower because I worked at the University of Minnesota and I was treated in a lot of the ways that whistleblowers are treated.
Mhm.
But my situation was more like that of Martha Stevens, right, at University of Cincinnati, who was in the English department. So, that. Um, I do resonate with these, with the honor stories, those stories of honor and shame. I basically felt, honestly, the way I would put it is I felt ashamed of the University of Minnesota. I'd worked here for like 10 or 11 years. I'd been very happy here. I identified with the university. I felt good about it. I felt proud about it. And then I felt kind of, yeah, very deeply ashamed that this would happen and the way everybody at the institution, or at least in the medical school and the administration, behaved, which was, the typical response: stonewalling, denial, protection of the people in charge, you know, um, you know, taking whatever action they could against me. And I lost a lot of friends during that episode. All of this came as a huge shock.
Mhm.
Um, but I think, like Martha Stevens said, you know, she just said, I would have felt ashamed of myself if I hadn't done anything. And I think I felt the same way. That said, I did feel very, I felt a lot of sympathy for Mary Weiss. Um, she was a very sympathetic person. She was smart. She was angry. She had been treated very badly. One of the things the aspects of that story, this is one of the things that made me really ashamed, that I didn't mention, was that when she filed litigation against the University of Minnesota, trying to get some sort of justice here, the lawsuit was dismissed on grounds of immunity, that the University of Minnesota was statutorily immune from her lawsuit. So no matter what the merits of the case, she couldn't sue. That should have been the end of it. But what the University of Minnesota did at that point was turn around and file a legal action against her, demanding that she pay us $56,000 to cover legal expenses in that lawsuit. And that to me just seemed like a disgraceful way to treat someone who has lost, her only son in this way.
So, did you see, was there a common way that whistleblowers protect themselves?
Um, well, I guess it depends on, protect themselves from what. Uh, there are the legal, there's the legal um, protection that you can get against retaliation.
Mhm.
And then there is the sort of protection that you try to muster, uh, to protect yourself psychologically.
Yeah.
One of the, I did talk to whistleblower attorneys when I was working on the book and also afterwards. And one of the things that ran through, the advice that they would give is, you need an attorney. Don't
Mhm.
think that you should go through this without an attorney. You don't need one. But that the first piece of advice that they give clients is, um, do anything you can to avoid doing this, because when you do, your life is going to change in ways that you don't anticipate, and it's going to be very bad. So if there's any way to avoid this, any way to let us do the work for you, if you've got evidence that you can leak to us, that you can give to us, so that we can do the job of trying to expose this rather than you, please do that. Because once it becomes known that you've turned on the group, your life is never going to be the same again. So that's, I think, a very good piece of advice. And I do have a story that came up afterwards that I can tell if anybody's interested, of someone who got in touch with me who did do that.
Mm.
It worked out way better. The other thing that people do, I think in general, the people who do have a group of fellow whistleblowers or at least allies and fellow travelers tend to come out less damaged than those who try to do it on their own.
Uh,
Um, Particularly those who try to do it while they are still at work in the organization. That turns out to be very, very difficult to survive unless you have friends and colleagues who are going to stick with you.
oh, okay. So many questions here. Okay, as you described these cases, I thought about this person, thought about Michael Moore and his whistleblowing about the water in Flint, Michigan. Do you have any thoughts about his approach to use media and public shaming as a weapon to shine light on things? Would that be a little bit like using a lawyer or?
Okay, so one of the things that I should have done, and I'll do now, is to distinguish whistleblowers from other people who expose wrongdoing.
Okay.
So, for example, whistleblowers are not investigative journalists or
Mhm.
filmmakers like Michael Moore is. Those people, that's their job to expose wrongdoing.
Yeah.
Whistleblowers are not like this. They're not professionals and they're not outsiders. They're on the inside. They will sometimes go to people like Michael Moore or, to an investigative journalist of some sort. But that's a different position. The other thing I should say is that whistleblowers are not victims. That's also a different thing.
Mhm.
In a very similar kind of position in a way, because victims are often punished, retaliated against, vilified in the same way that whistleblowers are. And there is a whistleblowing aspect to victim stories. But the distinguishing feature is that victims are speaking out about wrongs that have been done to them, and whistleblowers are typically speaking out about wrongs that have been done to others, right? And
Mhm.
the other thing I should say is that at least in my small subset of the whistleblowing world, medical research, it's usually victims who expose the abuses, not whistleblowers, right? The whistleblowers are relatively rare. It's usually families of victims or victims themselves who go to the press or a regulatory agency or a lawyer or someone and expose it. Um, and the other thing that they are not are activists in general, or anyone with some sort of experience in organizing protest. So one of the things um, I went out to one of the early interviews I did was I went out to Seattle to talk to this whistleblower there at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, John Pasando. And I remember one of the very first things he said to me, and I used it as an epigraph for the book, is every whistleblower is an amateur playing against professionals. This is absolutely true because most people, when they blow the whistle, have no idea what they're doing. They have no idea what to do. They have no idea who to go to. They have no experience of whistleblowing. They don't consider themselves a whistleblower. They've just seen something bad happening that they can't live with. And they sort of, in general, stumble through it. And very often it's only in retrospect that the idea of calling themselves a whistleblower occurs to them. But on the other side, there are the professionals, and that's the organization, because the organization has lawyers and PR people and crisis managers and a whole team of administrators who've been through this many times, and they know exactly how to handle it because they're pros. It's their job. And the very first thing that they usually do is try to discredit the whistleblower. This is one reason why solidarity is so important. It's way easier to discredit one person as a crank or somebody with an axe to grind or somebody who has some sort of financial interest at stake or something. It's way easier to do that than one person than it is to four or more of them. Right. I've explained all that, and now I forget what the original question actually was. What was it?
Um, let's see. Where did I go here? Um,
Oh, Michael Moore. Do
yeah.
I, you know, I would have loved to have somebody like Michael Moore on my side during this whole thing, um, because he's effective. You know,
Mhm.
this is another thing that, I mean, the thing about Michael Moore is that he's shameless. He'll do anything, like anything on camera that works is, he's up for it. Most whistleblowers are, I shouldn't say most, but a lot are media shy. They have no experience with the media. They would rather just, you know, stay on the sidelines in some way. Uh, they don't particularly want to be the star of a Michael Moore movie or anything like that. But once they've blown the whistle, um, the crusade, the effort to get some sort of justice often revolves around them. So there's really no way of avoiding it. I think, the difficulty that most whistleblowers have is not the choice of, do you work with somebody like Michael Moore or not? You know, People kept telling me, oh, you need to get on 60 Minutes. It's like, oh, yeah, that'll be easy. Um, the difficulty is getting anybody in the media interested in the first place, and then getting anyone to stay interested for the long haul,
Yeah.
because these battles go on for years and years and years, and people forget. And the media has other news to investigate.
So you were talking about like getting legal um help. The what so it's like because someone's like going, what legal protections are in place for whistleblowers? And I want to kind of couple that with a question. They're saying that, some insiders have a better um they reside in positions that are better for blowing whistles, such as a career civil servant, a tenured teacher, a priest, thing like that. But if you do the amateur versus professional, they're they're less likely to succeed if they don't have um, somebody having their back, such as a lawyer or something. Because I keep thinking of how do you complain to management, is what I kind of say, when management might be the problem. And
Yeah. This turns out to be part of the difficulty, um, because most people, by the time they blow the whistle, by the time they've kind of made the decision, nothing's going to happen unless I go outside the institution, they've already spent a lot of time inside the institution trying to get some sort of change with no success. And at that point, um, hiding your identity is not really an issue. By the time it becomes public, everybody knows you're the one
Mhm.
who went to the press. Um, Retaliate. So, there are federal whistleblower protections for people who work for the federal government. You have Charles Grassley, Senator Charles Grassley, to thank for a lot of that. That's his sort of big issue in his Senate career. Um, State whistleblower laws vary from state to state. They're very strong in some, not so much in others. It very rarely applied in the cases that that I talked about in the book, some of which were international, but most of which did not really involve the law. I mean, this is again one of the things about research ethics. There are federal guidelines, but no one in general, except in extreme cases, the Macchiarini case in Sweden, for example. In general, nobody's breaking the law. They're doing horrible things, but they're not criminal. And so, whistleblower protection. Most of the whistleblowers that I talked to would have very little legal protection against retaliation, unless they were fired in some state with strong whistleblower protection laws. I think the thing that a lot of people don't understand about whistleblowing is that it's these sort of existential issues, these personal issues that often turn out to be the ones that haunt people over the rest of their lives. I mean, a lot of these people I was talking about, some of these scandals, they took place in the 1970s, 60s and 70s. And so the whistleblowers are like in their 80s at this point. And these are people who are still, 40, 50 years after the fact, they're still haunted by this. They still don't can't get over it. They still wake up every day thinking about it. One of the whistleblowers I talked to had PTSD. He wound up, this is a practicing physician on crack, for a large part of his life. You know, Other people who are just damaged in a way that they never saw coming. Often, the thing that's most painful about it is losing your friends. I mean, a lot of people expect that it's not going to be great for them in their institution, that there will be disciplinary actions and that the administration is going to protect itself. But they just assume that their friends will stand by them. And then when they don't, it, it just sort of destroys everything they thought they had built their life around, you know? Those are the things that really, I think, are hard for people to deal with.
Mhm. Yeah, one person is wondering, do the whistleblowers have a spiritual or religious background that might compel them to expose wrongdoing? Or is it just the honor thing that comes up more?
I mean, even the honor thing is much more striking in some than in others. Um, if I just go through them, Ron Jones, he was a I think he still is a Presbyterian. He grew up in the Presbyterian church. We had a lot of conversations about Presbyterians because I grew up in the Presbyterian church. Martha Stevens, who grew up in Georgia, also Protestant religious upbringing. John Pasando was brought up Catholic. I think um, most of the people that I talked to uh, were not what I would think of as um, you know practicing serious church goers now,
Mhm.
although a fair number of them did have a religious upbringing, but some just pure atheists. The one thing, I mean, talking about honor, uh, there was one guy I talked to, Oscar Simonson, who, he's a Swede, not really the part of the world where you think of as a strong honor culture. You think of Mediterranean countries, for example, or Asian countries. Um, the Scots who settled the South here, Scots Irish who settled the South here in the States. Um, Yet Oscar he was the one person I spoke to more than anybody else who really embraced that honor ethic. You know, he, you know, he talked like a Viking. He was he saw it as a battle. He talked about how he did not respect. He didn't need the respect of anyone except the people that he himself respected. So the fact that the leadership of the Karolinska Institute stood with the criminal Macchiarini, and the leadership of the Nobel Prize Committee stood with him, didn't bother him a bit, because he said, I didn't respect these people in the first place. He said, it's very important to me that my patients know what I did. Um, and it's very important to him that, his colleagues, the people who stood with him, respect what he did. But, like a lot of people with this sense of honor, there's also this sense that, well, let me explain it the way he said it. He said, and this was after a few beers. He's such a sweet guy. He actually, now that I think about it, he spent a couple of years in Minnesota and when he was in kindergarten, because his father was a physician, um, either trained here or was visiting faculty here. Anyway, he had a lot of stories about. He had a very he had he spoke very fondly of his time growing up in Minneapolis. Um, but one of the things he said was, you know what? Here's the way I think. Um, there were thousands of people at the Karolinska Institute in the hospital who knew what Macchiarini was doing. Only four of us spoke up. He said, I don't hold it against them. It just means I'm better than they are. And then he started laughing. He said, I know that sounds terrible, but I really believe it. That's kind of the honor ethic, you know. Um, I think, feels as if he has to hold himself to a certain standard. Other people apparently don't feel that. And, you know, that means he's better.
Now, the organizations that end up giving awards to those that are responsible for the unethical studies, um, do those come up when they're talking about the accolades of those people? And that would be an interesting thing to look at. It's like, how did they award that?
How was it presented? You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. I suspect not. My sense is that very often or at least this was definitely my sense here at the University of Minnesota, that the awards are a kind of defense against the external critics. That if you can show that this person was really doing good work and has the respect of their colleagues, then um, then that is your way of saying, people on the outside don't really understand how important this research really was and how good this person really was and what great work they were doing. And I think very often that is genuinely felt. I mean, within the world of academic medicine, I think people in academic medicine do feel as if they are engaged in a humanitarian mission, that there is something noble about it, that they've made sacrifices to do it, and that people on the outside just don't understand. And and so when there are attacks from the outside, there's a understandably a sense of defensiveness to it all.
How can patients' rights who are enrolled in medical studies be better protected? Have you seen changes in university research guidelines recommended or no?
No, I got no words of encouragement or optimism to say. You know, if you're looking for that, you're talking to the wrong person. I've seen no improvement whatsoever. Um, yeah, I mean, what I will say is that some institutions do better than others, uh, and we're not one of the ones that does well. I don't know if anybody has followed the recent scandal. It didn't get a lot of local attention, although it's got a lot of international attention of uh, fraud in Alzheimer's research at the University of Minnesota. The University of Minnesota now has the distinction of having the two of the five most highly cited retracted articles because of fraud uh, ever in the scientific literature. Um, I remember having a conversation with investigative journalist Charles Piller, who was one of the ones who getting to the bottom of this and exposed it. And he was saying, there are just some institutions where when you hear about a scandal in the medical school, you just shake your head and go, not them again. You know, Duke University, one of them. Southern California, another one. University of Minnesota, I'm sad to say, is one of them. And I wish that the University of Minnesota would take it seriously. Uh, they just don't. And I don't know what can be done. You know, whatever I've tried to do has been a complete failure. I will say that.
So let's see, looking. So would you say that whistleblower scenario is much rarer to people who stand up against, say, well, they're using like standing up against injustice, oppression of others, say the Germans under Hitler or Russians against Stalin. Would that be kind of a similar, just the rarity of people being willing to stand up? I mean, because like you said, these articles are being called out internationally versus locally. And um is it easier to see from further away than sometimes close up?
Huh, that's interesting. Maybe, maybe it is. I'm not sure you would say it's easier to see.
Mhm.
Um, it's easier to take some sort of action. It's easier to stand up when
Yeah.
you're standing up, in a safe place from far away. Um, those kinds of examples are they're different, but not completely unrelated, right? So one of the things that again, small sample size, right? Um, I only looked at a small number of cases here,
Mhm.
but it is striking to me that the cases, the scandals where the whistleblowers had some measure of success were often the ones in which the scandal sort of dovetailed with a larger social movement. So, for example, most people know about the Tuskegee syphilis study. This was, 400 black men with syphilis in Macon County, Alabama, who went untreated for their syphilis at the hands of the federal government for 40 years. Sort of the iconic American case. It was exposed by Peter Buxton in 1972. But by the time, and I should say, Peter started trying to expose that in 1965. It took him 7 years.
Mhm.
Um, but when that was eventually exposed, it was seen as a case of institutionalized medical racism, right? And
Mhm.
so the outrage against it dovetailed with the civil rights movement. If that can happen, it happened very much the same way with the unfortunate experiment in New Zealand and the women's movement. If that can happen, if the particular scandal dovetails with something outside the medical research world that is bigger, that a lot more people have a stake in, um, then the chances of success, I think, are are magnified, right? The problem is that very few research scandals actually do that.
Mhm.
So if there's nothing like that, then um, very often what you have is, just a brief moment of public outrage that then vanishes and the whole thing goes away.
So, one person posted that regarding the U of M Alzheimer's case, just discussed that the U supposedly conducted a quiet years-long investigation out of the public eye, and that the researcher in question recently suddenly resigned. Um,
Yeah.
it's one of those things where it's like, I mean, that could dovetail with, aging population here, where we have, if you wanted to expose it, but when it's done quietly, you're not going to see that.
This is, I mean, okay, that I think that's an important point, right? Uh, and it's not unusual. This is the way, at least here in North America, this is the way things are handled, quietly out of the public eye. Um, there is one exception to that, and that's the New Zealand case. So this again, the unfortunate experiment, you know, many women with cervical cancer went untreated as part of the unfortunate experiment and went on to develop cervical cancer. This was exposed. I mean, the doctors trying to expose it again worked for years without going to the press. That was unthinkable for them. But it was eventually exposed with the help of two really first-rate investigative journalists uh, in New Zealand writing for Metro magazine. But when it finally did come out, the New Zealand federal government um, acted immediately. So they appointed a judicial inquiry, something that, Britain and Commonwealth countries have. They reported a respected woman judge, Sylvia Cartwright, to head it. It got started almost immediately, I think like within a month of when it was exposed. They
Mhm.
held all their hearings in public. The women who were victims, any woman who was victimized in the study was given the opportunity to speak publicly if they wanted, and privately if they didn't want to speak publicly. The doctors at fault were forced to answer publicly. I mean, this was like New Zealand's Senate Watergate hearings. This was all covered by the press constantly. It was happening every day and in the news. And then when it was done, uh, you know, they sanctioned the researchers, they compensated the victims, and they remade their research oversight system completely, uh, fixed it. And in the 35 plus years since the scandal was exposed, they haven't had another major scandal. That is the way that you would want these things to play out,
Mhm.
right? You don't want institutions to just quietly have a private investigation, not let anybody see it, and then just quietly um, deal with anything that they find out of the public eye.
Oh. Would you say that is the University of Minnesota uncomfortable with you conducting courses like this and discourages us, and that which discourages us about the ethics of the University of Minnesota? Um,
Probably. I think they probably are. Um, I should say I'm not in the medical school anymore. I'm not in the bioethics center. I'm in the philosophy department now, which is across the river and a much more comfortable place for me. And my colleagues there are uh, supportive, and so um, that's been a good move for me.
No. Okay. Let's see. Do you think media pressure against the University of Minnesota would have success? Only if we could maintain it, I suppose.
Well, this is the problem. There was coverage in the Markinson case.
Mm-hmm.
So it was originally the St. Paul Pioneer Press. As things went on, there was a journalist, Jeff Ballion, working for Fox 9,
Mm-hmm.
who got very involved. There was actually a second victim, not just Dan Markinson, named Robert Huber, that Jeff Ballion, whose story Jeff Ballion told. And, you know, there were occasional stories in the Star Tribune. Here's the difficulty. One, we live in an age when people don't really pay attention to newspapers anymore. I mean, you can have something in the Star Tribune, the Pioneer Press, and at least, you know, people at the U will not even know about it. I mean, they don't think, uh, you know, so that's a big problem. The other problem is, and this is just basically in the nature of newspapers. Newspapers report news. Journalists report news. If there's nothing new, there's nothing to report. And so it is very difficult, just by nature of the job, to keep public pressure on an institution through the press. Because if there's nothing new happening, there is no story for them to cover. What I should say is we would have never had any success at all in this case if it were not for Arnie Carlson. Arnie Carlson is responsible. He, to me, is the hero of this case here. Um, he was the one politician or former politician who was willing to actually talk to me, um, and who, you know, after talking to me, um, got involved. He seemed to take it personally. I mean, I don't know if you remember. Arnie's time uh, in the governor's office was really before I arrived, but you know, people who had been here for longer, you know, would talk about Arnie Carlson as this great friend of the U. That he, you know, he had his governor's portrait taken wearing you know, a Gophers jacket. He got one of his degrees at the U. He was a big supporter of the U, and I think he felt kind of like I did. He felt let down or disappointed that the U wouldn't do the right thing, and I think took offense when they just, you know, when he tried to meet with people at the U, they just, you know, they just blew him off. And so he got very involved in the case and started speaking out publicly and calling for the resignation of the president and the resignation of all the members of the Board of Regents, and went to talk to the legislature and twisted some arms. And, you know, he knew way more about how to get some sort of action on this than any of us did. And by us, I mean mainly my colleague Lee Turner in the Bioethics Center and my friend Nikki Jerry, who was a nurse at Fairview. Um, we were trying as hard as we could, but we didn't really know how these things worked. Arnie knew how it worked, and it's really his pressure that got the legislative auditor's report, which is, you know, really the one thing that we could point to as a success.
So someone mentioned that Liz Cheney's memoir, which is basically an expose of the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, is titled Oath and Honor, and that her story follows the arc of your discussion pretty well in terms of that. So it might be a good co-read if you want to.
Exactly. I didn't know she had a memoir out, but I remember when she was writing about this, thinking, yes, she talks exactly in that way. that sort of language of honor. And she was treated the way that whistleblowers are treated, just completely cast out, from people that she probably considered friends, definitely colleagues, and, you know, um, constituted her sort of what made up her professional identity, definitely her public identity.
Mhm. So let's see, we got 5 minutes to go. These are the ones that are left are a little bit more like looking at Karen Silkwood, Edward Snowden. Um, any thoughts on how that compares to, or no thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Silkwood case, the sort of golden age of whistleblowing, the age in which whistleblowing emerged as a term
Mhm.
was that era.
Okay.
Frank Serpico, the one everybody thinks about is Daniel Ellsberg, Karen Silkwood. Um, there are Ron Ridenour with the My Lai massacre. So this was the era in which the sort of the early 70s, in which you had these insiders speaking out about abuses in their own organizations. But there was no word for that did not condemn them, right? The only words were things like snitch and rat and turncoat and Judas, right? So it's sometimes attributed to Ralph Nader, uh, possibly also Charles Peters, the founder of the Washington Monthly, Taylor Branch. Um, the first sort of widespread public use started to come out of Washington, D.C. in this era. There are a couple of books that came out in 1972 with the word whistleblower in them. One was by Charlie Peters and Taylor Branch, the other was by Ralph Nader. But the very idea of whistleblowing was we need some way of referring to these people with a positive moral valence as an alternative to snitch or rat or turncoat. I think the difficulty is this is what the difficulty with any kind of moral language like that. You try to replace a stigmatizing term which with one is that's not stigmatizing, and eventually that term becomes stigmatized. So
Stigmatized, yeah.
um, I remember uh, when I was working on this in Washington, D.C., when I was at the Library of Congress, there's a whistleblowing award given out to John Barnett, Mitch Barnett, the Boeing whistleblower, who you might remember committed suicide about a year ago now, I believe. Uh, but this was 2019, and he was given this award. And when they referred to him as a whistleblower on stage, he just kind of, bristled and said, I don't really like it when you call me a whistleblower. He said, when I hear whistleblower, I hear snitch, and I don't like to think of myself as a snitch, which I think, made everybody, you know, think, oh, shoot, we have to think of another word now because, you know, now the very purpose of that word has been subverted.
Mhm.
You know?
No, well, we're coming up. It's 3:59 on my clock. Um, sorry for those few of you that we didn't get to your questions, but just want to tie things up here. This is our last session for the winter sessions. Um, Tuesday with the Scholar is not going to be happening this spring. I'm taking off from that. I'm still hosting Great Decisions, and which is current events. That'll be in April, American Foreign Policy in the Middle East and International Cooperation on Climate Change. If you're interested in that, that's on Fridays. I'm also hosting Presidential History of Theodore Roosevelt with J.B. Anderson, who's a historian on presidential history. I will be coming back in June for the summer session. I already have 4 weeks booked, and that'll be exciting. We're closing out with looking at the Supreme Court docket from the 24-25 session. So something to look forward to. And once again, Carl, thank you so much for coming on. I was really have been looking forward to this one for quite a while. I think I originally contacted you back in October of last year.
It was
So
a while ago.
I
It was a
really
while ago.
wanted this one to happen. So
Well, thank
um,
you for having me. I really appreciate it.
yeah, so everyone, reminder, the book is called The Occasional Human Sacrifice. You can find it in bookstores, you can find it in libraries. Very interesting read and highly recommended. So once again, thank you. Thank all of you for your questions out there. They've kept the conversation rolling and just been an enjoyable time. So everyone go have a safe day and we will see you later this spring.